Currently, Dan is, in my mind at least, probably the most knowledgeable and most accomplished person on the planet in terms of understanding the causes and the consequences of biological invasions. That is, those nasty, gnarly species that get into the wrong habitats and tend to drive other species extinct and sort of make our lives miserable. And Dan is absolutely a world leader in that area. He's a fellow for the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences. He's a fellow of the Ecological Society of America. He's a fellow of a number of other very, very prestigious societies. He's the editor of the journal Biological Invasions. He's a co-editor or area editor for several other of the most prestigious journals in science journals in the world. And in 2012, he was elected to be a fellow of the United States National Academy of Sciences. And for those of you who don't know, sort of after being elected to the National Academy of Sciences, sort of the next step is you get a Nobel Prize, and after that, I don't know what you do. So anyhow, Dan's right there. So with that, sorry I've talked so long, but you know how it is. Please join me in welcoming Dan Simberloff.
Well, thank you, Brad, for a way overly generous and somewhat embarrassing introduction. It's very exciting to be here, and I greatly appreciate the invitation. I haven't been at UCLA in many years, since well before the founding of the Kretz Center, and since it's almost from its initiation, I've been reading papers from the center and hearing talks based on research at the center, and it's really exciting to be here. And I have a personal relationship with some of that research, which I'll mention a little later in my talk. So I am going to talk about biological invasions, and I'll begin by showing that it's really, even though it's one of the major conservation issues of today, it's a fairly new concern. It was happening, but people didn't recognize the consequences of it. And I'll talk then a bit about how it's developed in its relatively young history and where I see it going, exciting new directions. And then I'll spend a good while talking about a series of controversies that have beset the field from several different directions, and my view of how they're playing out and affecting both the science and the conservation consequences of invasions. Although a number of early explorers in North America had noticed species from Europe, really the first scientific observation or the first scientific description of introduced species was by this Swedish Finn, Per Kalm, who was sent by Linnaeus to the New World to describe what was there. And he noticed, among other things, that there were 15 species of plants that he knew were European. And he noted this. He didn't talk about their impact, just they were there. And that began about 1 century of various kinds of explorer naturalists traveling around the world and recording what was there, and increasingly noticing that species that were there included many species they knew to be introduced from elsewhere. So the early 19th century founders of the field of biogeography had copious descriptions of introduced species, not anything about their ecology or impact, just that they were there. And 2 of them are the ones that first introduced the sort of taxonomy of species that we now use, that they're either native or they're introduced, or we don't know, it is one or the other, but we can't tell with current evidence which. We now call it cryptogenic. The Victorian naturalist explorers that we all have read about were very much in this tradition. They recorded many introduced species of both plants and animals all around the world, but oddly to me, only 2 of them talked at all about impact and seemed to recognize that there, of course, this was before the founding of the whole field of ecology, but still there was natural history and people had made ecological observations before, but only 2 of them recognized ecological impact. One, of course, was Darwin, and the other was Wallace. So Darwin, on his travels across Patagonia, noticed that large tracts of the pampas were dominated by two species introduced within probably 1 century before his, at most 1.5 centuries before his arrival, completely dominating the pampas. But it didn't lead to any sustained interest in the phenomenon of impacts of introduced species. The rest of the 19th century and much of the 20th century, it was just recording what was there. Often, people refer to Charles Elton, who was a great English ecologist, who was one of the founders of the field of animal ecology. And in 1958, he wrote a really great book for a lay audience that you can see here, The Ecology of Invasions by Animals and Plants. And this is, it was based on 3 BBC radio broadcasts, and it's all about impacts of introduced species, of animals, of plants, even of microbes. And it's often said to be the book that founded the field. As this D. Wade book review in Nature 50 years later calls it. But in fact, it had no impact on the field, and people did not still begin studying impacts of biological invasions. And you can see this. You see here, Elton's book was published in 1958, and these are references in the scientific literature to biological invasions. And you can see there were none for almost 30 years. And then suddenly, in the very late 1980s, the beginning of an explosion of interest in biological invasions. All that came about because of a project of the Scientific Committee on Problems of the Environment, or SCOPE, whose raison d'etre is, it's an international organization, and their purpose is to bring together scientists to address problems of the environment and try to come up with partial solutions to various environmental problems. And in 1980, SCOPE, the Scientific Committee on Problems of the Environment, convened we now call it working group or workshop on environmental problems that various Mediterranean ecosystems were facing, not only in the Mediterranean, but in Mediterranean climate areas like parts of California, Australia, South Africa, Chile, etc. And they met in South Africa, in Stellenbosch, South Africa, and the conferees could not help but notice two things. First of all, is each one would give his or her talk on the problems besetting his or her system. They were almost all talking about introduced species, somehow being the big problem. And then they took a field trip into the region around Stellenbosch, which is one of the hot spots of plant biodiversity. It's called the Fynbos, and it has thousands and thousands of species found only there, but no trees among them. And they could see trees, well, the contrast isn't very good, but they could see trees from Europe and from Australia beginning to invade. And so they thought, wow. And in discussions at dinner, they said, we should actually have an entire SCOPE project just on invasions of the Mediterranean. And they took this proposal to the SCOPE Governing Board at their next meeting, which was in Ottawa, Canada in 1983, I believe. And the SCOPE Governing Board said, yes, that's a good idea, but it should not just be impacts of invasions into the Mediterranean type ecosystems, but impacts of invasions, period. And thus was born the SCOPE project called the Ecology of Biological Invasions. And that was a project that went on for 4 years and involved many workshops all around the world. There were volumes published from various workshops in the Netherlands, Great Britain, Australia, in Mediterranean areas, in the tropics. And the real driving force behind this, if anyone could be called the father of invasion biology, it's actually Hal Mooney, whose picture is there, who's a plant ecologist and physiologist at Stanford. And two books in particular from the SCOPE project, the one for North America and Hawaii, and then the Global Synthesis volume, were very widely read and published. They were published, very widely read, and they engaged lots of people in thinking about and studying invasions who had not been involved in this area before. And that's really when this field began. So we're talking about, 25 years ago. So it's a very new field, and it's important to recognize that with respect to some of these controversies I'll talk about. The first decade or so, and even before the SCOPE project, the kinds of impacts people were looking at were very obvious kinds of impacts, often from large predatory species introduced to a place and eating some native species or some group of them. So the snakehead from Asia that was introduced about 15 years ago now in Maryland, only 30 miles from Washington, D.C., got a huge amount of attention because it was right by the nation's capital. The small Indian mongoose introduced to control rats, deliberately introduced all over the world, many island systems, never really did control rats, but it actually caused the extinction or contributed to the extinction of several native mammal species, at least 2 amphibians, and several bird species. The famous brown tree snake introduced from the Admiralty Islands to Guam, it's an arboreal snake, eating all the birds so that the forests of Guam are silent, leading to this book, and no birds sing. And then there's the snake du jour is the Burmese python. I mean, snakes get a lot of attention. When you have a snake this big, of course it gets a huge amount of attention. So there are now a minimum of 10,000 of these, and some people have credible estimates of more like 100,000 of them in South Florida, and they've already caused the decline in numbers of all the medium and large-sized mammals, and at least one bird species in the Everglades National Park, so attracting a huge amount of attention. The Nile perch is a famous invasive species of this sort. It's a huge fish, and what's famous about it is it was introduced into Lake Victoria, which is the locus of one of the best known and spectacular evolutionary radiations of species, the cichlid fishes, of which there were at one time over 200 species just in Lake Victoria, and about 150 of them are now extinct because they were eaten up by that fish. And here's an excellent book and an interesting documentary film just about that case. Plants, if you see something like this, even if it's underwater, it's such a large fish and it was happening so quickly, could not help but be noticed. Plants don't do anything as dramatic as eating something, but sometimes you see them overgrowing things in a very striking way and attracts attention. This is the famous killer alga, Chlorpetaxifolia, that was introduced with dumped aquarium contents out of the Oceanographic Museum in Monaco and spread around the Mediterranean, covering thousands of acres of the very narrow, shallow nearshore area, overgrowing seagrass meadows, and thereby destroying fisheries. Also introduced into California, here in Los Angeles at Huntington Harbor and at San Diego and near Carlsbad, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Here's another California example, giant reed, Arundo donax, deliberately introduced, by the way, to California in the early 19th century for thatch and spread, and I'm sure many of you have seen this. I've seen areas around Riverside that are just seas of giant reed and very hard to manage. So that's the kind of very obvious, dramatic impact that attracted attention for about the first decade or so of the field. If you were to ask what's new and exciting in the field, I think there are two important new directions that are telling us about a lot more impacts and even more consequential impacts of introduced species, and also telling us a lot about how some of these invasions occur and why some of them have these dramatic impacts and others not so much. The first sort of area of rapid growth in the field is what we call ecosystem-wide impacts of introduced species. The cases I talked about before, like the Burmese python, you have one species attacking one other native species or a group of them all in the same way. And that's about it. It's sort of like a one trophic level impact. But there are species that do a lot more than that, and it's subtle, but maybe in the end, even more consequential. There was actually, this was first pointed out in the scope conferences in the late 1980s by Peter Watusek, also at Stanford. And Peter, at the scope conferences, I was at the two of them, talks about this plant. It's now Morellifia. It's called firebush. At that time, it was Myricafia. And what Peter and his colleagues showed in this paper and in several others was that this is a plant that is from the Atlantic. I believe it was introduced to Hawaii from the Azores. And it's a nitrogen fixer. And in the mid-elevations of the Big Island of Hawaii, there are no native nitrogen fixers. Hawaii is a young island with nutrient-poor soil. And here suddenly you have a plant that's fertilizing the Big Islands. All the native plants, and there are very many native species, are highly adapted to the nutrient-poor soil that already existed. And all the exotic plants that you would see in people's backyards in cities like Hilo around the Big Island could not easily invade nature because they wouldn't survive because the soil is nutrient poor and they're not adapted to that. Now suddenly you have a plant that's fertilizing the Big Islands. And what Peter showed and has continued to show with further work is that this is changing, by changing the nitrogen cycle, it's changing the whole island, it's allowing invasion by other plants, and it's really affecting the entire ecosystem or group of ecosystems. Since then, it's been shown that this is really part of a larger invasion phenomenon that I've called invasional meltdown, in which several introduced species all interact in ways that exacerbate the impacts that any one might have had. As it happens, Morellifia, the main seed disperser, is the Japanese white-eye bird, and the second major seed disperser is a European wild boar introduced there. And all the earthworms there, they're all introduced, and they're found in densities 2 to 8 times greater than anywhere else under Morellifia trees, working the nitrogenous litter into the soil and speeding up this entire sort of nitrification of the Big Island. So they're all acting together to produce this change in the entire ecosystem. The other example that I'll give is from Tad Fukami and his co-workers. Tad was actually a graduate student of mine, but he did this work as a postdoc, so I had nothing to do with it. What Tad and his colleagues did was they considered the impacts of rats. And the way they did this was they looked at a series of islands around the main islands, the Big Islands of New Zealand. Some of these islands had rats, either Norway or ship rats, and other of these islands lacked rats. Now, before this paper, there were easily 100 publications in the scientific literature on the impact of rats on islands, and virtually every one of them was on how the rats destroy seabird rookeries and sometimes drive seabird populations to the very edge of extinction. So all about impact of rats on seabirds. This was a very different sort of study because what they did was they looked at what the loss of the seabirds did to the rest of the ecosystem. And here you can see each one of these histograms is looking at, this is just the below ground components of the biological community, or components. And each one of the histograms is for a different group of species, like small land snails, springtails, or columbuans, rotifers, et cetera, et cetera. And they're always comparing rat-free and rat-invaded islands. And as you can see, virtually every case, they're different, very different in many cases. And this is just the below ground part of the ecosystem. They similarly examined the impact on the above ground parts of the ecosystem, especially on plants, and then on some animals that live in plants. So it's a totally different kind of take on the impacts of an introduced species. Previously, people just talked about predation on seabirds, but now you see it's changing the entire biology of the island ecosystem. And now, in the wake of papers by Vitusik and Fukami and others, there's an explosion of research of exactly this sort, looking at ecosystem-wide impacts of particular invasions, often by changing nutrient cycles like the Morellophytid, sometimes by changing fire cycles of the hydrology cycle, or various means. And it's there are more and more interesting papers showing an ever-increasing range of previously unsuspected impacts of invasions. The second major new thrust in the last decade or so of invasion biology has to do with the inculcation of evolution and genetics into invasions. It's an odd fact that I don't understand very well, that it took 15 or 20 years before evolutionists and geneticists got very interested in invasions. There were a number of prominent evolutionists and geneticists associated with the SCOPE project, came to the workshops, and one might have thought that the invasion of a species into a new environment with totally new coexisting species would be a phenomenon that might elucidate a number of evolutionary questions, like the relative importance of random forces in changing genetics, like drift on the one hand versus natural selection on the other, the speed of evolution, et cetera, et cetera. But it didn't really do that for a good while. This is the very first monograph on the whole idea of evolution and genetics in introduced species. But beginning about that time, there's just an explosion of papers showing evolution by introduced species, evolution by native species in response to some introduction, and using genetics in various ways to elucidate invasions, mechanisms, and impacts. And I'll expand a little bit about one of these invasions, just to give you one of these aspects of the use of genetics, just to give you a sense of the kind of thing I'm talking about. So here's probably the paper that attracted the most attention at the beginning of this sort of efflorescence of the field. This is by John Colby and co-workers, and they're looking at an introduced species, the Cuban brown anole, which is now extremely common in Florida and in some habitats has replaced our native green anole. And what they're looking at here, and what the colors represent, is haplotypes, part of the genotype. And what they showed was, if you go to any one place in Cuba, the native range of this species, there's very little genetic diversity. They're all pretty much the same and different from the population in any other part of Cuba. Whereas, if you go to Florida and look, almost any place you look, there's a lot of genetic diversity. It was a big surprise, sort of what had been called the paradox, the genetic paradox of invasions was, well, we assume that these populations usually start from a small number of individuals, so they would be genetically impoverished. And from conservation biology, we know as almost an article of faith that genetically impoverished small populations are at great danger of being extinguished, partly for genetic reasons, inbreeding depression, inability to evolve in response to changing environment, etc. Yet here we have invasions that must have begun with very small populations, and they're not only not in danger of extinction, but they've spread over half the landscape, often replacing native species. So what this paper showed was that we were wrong about an assumption. We assumed that these invasions start with one introduction of a few individuals, but now we know for this case that there must be many introductions of the Cuban brown anole from different parts of Cuba into Florida. And far from being genetically impoverished, the Florida population of the species has more genetic diversity than any part in the native range. Incidentally, it also shows that the subsequent introductions to Hawaii and to Taiwan were not from Cuba, but almost certainly from Florida. This is a very important paper, and it caused people to think a lot about this. And since then, there have been many, many papers, easily 100, with different species showing that what had been thought to be single introductions were actually multiple introductions from different sources, and it's at least partially resolved this genetic paradox. One thing this paper didn't do is explain why exactly the genetic diversity has been important to them, or has it helped the Cuban anole. The initial thought was always, almost from the time this paper first appeared, that it must be hybridization, and that these different genotypes, they're all in the same species, hybridize, and they're producing different combinations of genotypes, some of which must be very well adapted to parts of Florida and hence spread. But Colby and his group didn't actually demonstrate hybridization. So the other sort of the null hypothesis, to use Brad's term, would be, well, you just have a bunch of genotypes there, and if you have several genotypes, it's more likely than if you just had one genotype that one of them will be well adapted to the environment and will spread. So you have a higher probability of having a well-adapted species. And here's where my connection to the Kretz Center comes in. This is a wonderful paper that's just been published. Everyone should run out and read it. And it's part of the doctoral dissertation of my student, Raphael Zenny, who has worked on invasions by North American pines into Brazil, which has no pines. And in particular, the most invasive of the pines is loblolly pine, which is widely distributed in eastern and southern North America. And what Raphael was able to show, and what the odd thing is that some plantations established 50 years ago with loblolly pine have actually led to invasions in the surrounding areas, and others haven't, and we could not find any obvious ecological explanation. And Raphael's idea was maybe they're genetically different, certain genotypes are very good. And we got records and found that when these plantations were established, they all involved provenances or seed sources from 3 different distinct areas of North America, each one. And at this point, Raphael came to the Kretz Center to take the course the Kretz Center ran in using molecular genetics to deal with ecological problems. And he learned it helped him frame the question better and taught him how actually to do the work and the analysis. And we were subsequently able to show that, in fact, in any one of these areas where loblolly pine is spreading, it's not hybrids at all. There are very few hybrids, and the leading edge of the invasion is always one of the provenances, one of the genotypes is spreading, and the others may still be surviving in the plantation, but they're not spreading into the surrounding environment. So in this case, it's not hybridization at all, and yet the genetic mixture is very important because it means there's a higher probability. It's a different genotype in each case. It's a higher probability that one of the genotypes will be very well adapted. So that's my main connection with the Kretz Center. It's an important one. In some cases it is hybridization. This is an excellent piece of research on reed canary grass, another one of these introduced wetland reeds. In this case, it turns out reed canary grass was actually native, but a minor component of many wetland floras. And then over a century ago, a number of different genotypes were introduced from Europe. And what Laverne and Molesky were able to show using genetic techniques is that it's actually hybrids among these European genotypes that have led this massive invasion. And the native genotypes are still not invasive, and no one of the European genotypes is invasive. It's hybrids among them. As a final example of this issue of genetic diversity, all around the world over the last 40 or 50 years, there have been these inexplicable sudden explosions of plant pathogens devastating various kinds of forests and forest industries. So like you have sudden oak death here in California. And it now has been demonstrated genetically that in many of these cases, and it might be the case for almost all of them, what you have is a native plant pathogen that was more or less innocuous because the native plants were adapted to it. An introduced but related pathogen comes in, they hybridize, and the resulting hybrid is extremely virulent and is the one that's wiping out all the trees. And as one example, alder blight in Europe, which is just eliminating all the alders in Europe. And it turns out that Phytophthora, which is a water mold or oomycete, it's like a fungus, is very good at hybridizing. And many of these formerly inexplicable sudden explosions of a plant pathogen turn out to be hybridization events. So, in the midst of this tremendous amount of research and growth and knowledge of invasions in a very short time, as I said earlier, maybe 25 years or so, we have a series of controversies about invasions and how to manage invasions. It sort of came to a head in a paper in Nature published in 2011 by the ecologist Mark Davis and 18 other ecologists, basically saying, sort of hinting at xenophobia from this title, Don't Judge Species on Their Origins. I mean, that's a pretty loaded title. And they're also saying, well, most introduced species don't really cause big problems, so why are we, maybe the problem is overblown and we should only worry about a few invasions, the ones that are obviously causing impact, and it's all very expensive, and we should de-emphasize this whole issue. And I quickly got 140 other ecologists in 1 week to sign a letter to Nature. They gave us 200 words to to say, no, these guys are wrong, and so it became sort of a spitting match. And then there's another recent paper, again in Nature, by a pretty eminent English ecologist, Chris Thomas. You can see, he says, the whole thing is irrational. Rethink our irrational dislike of invading species. Those of you who worry about invasions, now you know you're irrational. And Mark Davis, the senior author of that original Nature paper, wrote an entire textbook, and quite a good one, about biological invasions, how they happen, why some spread, why Except the last two chapters are very odd. He calls for the end of the field. He wrote a whole book about invasion biology and then said we should not have this field anymore, hinting that it's xenophobic and saying most of them don't cause impacts, etc. So it was pretty striking. And that led to another paper, another call for the end of invasion biology. And then, again, I had to respond calling for an end to the calls for the end of invasion biology. So it's become pretty controversial. And there are really 5 major distinct threads to this controversy about what we should do about invasion biology. And I'll talk about all of them, one of them in some detail, the others pretty quickly, maybe 2 of them in some detail. One is this argument that, well, most invasions don't have major impact, so why are we even worried about them? And I think we have to take that assertion, and it is an assertion, with a big grain of salt, because in fact we don't know what the impacts of the great majority of introduced species are, because we haven't studied them. The ones we focused on are the ones with big, obvious impacts, like the brown tree snake or the Nile perch or the killer alga. For example, in North America, there are almost 200,000, North America and north of Mexico, there are almost 200,000 species of plants and animals, not counting microbes, native, and there are about 7,000 introduced species of plants and animals established in nature, not just in people's backyards. And of that 7,000, we know of substantial impacts of now between 1,500 and maybe 2,000. But the great majority of those 7,000, we haven't really studied what their impacts are. And as you can see, for example, from the case with firebush in Hawaii, some of these impacts may be very important, but they're subtle and they take a while to develop. And so we can't really say that most of them don't have impacts. We only say we don't know that most of them have impacts. Another important consideration here is that a well-known demonstrated phenomenon in invasion biology is there's often a long time lag between a species getting to a place and establishing a population, and then much later spreading. For decades and sometimes a century, the population remains restricted and innocuous, and then suddenly, more or less suddenly, spreads across the landscape with major impacts. For example, giant reed in California was introduced in the early 19th century. It didn't become a problem and didn't spread much until the mid-20th century. In many cases, subsequent research shows why there was a lag and what caused it to break. Other cases we don't know yet, but the phenomenon is not in doubt. So the fact that a lot of introduced species we don't know of a bad impact, even if they're not having one, it doesn't mean they won't in the future, many of them. A group of Europeans have coined the term invasion debt to capture the idea that many species already introduced of no known substantial impact in the future will generate major impacts. The argument that most introduced species are probably not harmful is often accompanied by one or both of two other sort of subsidiary arguments. One is the observation that don't some native species also become invasive or cause the same kinds of problems? We don't usually use the term invasive for a native species, but we report in the literature similar phenomena. We use different words. We might say for vegetation, we often say encroaching, But it is true that some native species sometimes do become invasive. But it's actually not many. My students and I, a while ago, looked at all of the plant species in the United States, all the native species and all the introduced species, and which ones of them had been reported to have some sort of impact of the sort you see with invasions. And we found 70 to 80 cases where native species did have impacts, but this is per species, 40 times more likely than for native species. And the other interesting thing we found is that almost every time a native species could be shown to be doing something invasive, it was in the wake of some other human influence on the environment. So, for example, this is one of 4 species of junipers that sometimes have been reported to be invasive into grasslands. In every instance, it's associated with either fire suppression or overgrazing or both. So native species very rarely become invasive. Introduced species much more frequently do. Since we published this paper, there's 2 other recent papers looking at different groups of species, finding very, very similar results, that introduced species much more frequently become invasive. The second observation that one sometimes hears with respect to this idea of what's so special about introduced species is that, well, aren't some introduced species beneficial? Like most of our major food crops were ultimately introduced from the Old World. And I guess this was brought to a head with this paper in the journal Conservation Biology by Martin Schleifer et al., giving about 20 examples of introduced species that had been beneficial in some way to conservation. And once again, they gave us, in this case, 2,000 words to respond. And we pointed out that in every one of these cases, there were negative impacts that were very consequential. And so we'd have to think about the full array of impacts of a species before we'd say it's a net benefit. To give you an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, one of the worst plant invaders in my area, which in East Tennessee, is Amur honeysuckle. It's a Eurasian shrub. You have it in California, but it's not one of your major invaders. And here, if we had better contrast, you see it growing in the ground of our, overgrowing the ground cover of a native forest. And it's sort of interesting because we have endemic in our area an always lethal encephalitis called lacrosse encephalitis, and it's carried by a native mosquito. It's not common, but Knoxville is the center of the distribution. And as it happens, mosquito doesn't, its breeding biology is such that it doesn't do well when there's an Amur honeysuckle invasion. So isn't this great? It decreases lacrosse encephalitis. On the other hand, much more common diseases that we have are a series of tick-borne diseases. We're just beginning to have Lyme disease in my area, but several other major tick-borne diseases that are very bad. And as it happens, the ticks really love Amur honeysuckle. And there are many more ticks and a great increase in the number of diseases. So my point is not, to do the calculations for these. My point is that introduced species generally don't just have one impact. We have to think carefully about the whole array before you say they're net benefit. A second observation that one occasionally sees is that, usually introduced species don't quickly cause extinctions, except maybe on islands, and they may cause great decreases in the populations of some native species by various means, by eating them or by overgrowing them or by changing the habitat in some other ways. But usually, in many places, there are more species present because you have all the introduced species and at least most of the natives. So isn't that great? They're increasing biodiversity. So this captures it very well. An example that's almost always pointed to is the Hawaiian birds. When humans first colonized the Hawaiian Islands about 1,000 years ago, there were at least 114 native bird species in Hawaii, almost all of them endemic. And at least 55 are now extinct. However, at about the same time, beginning in the late 19th century, there were well over 80 species of birds introduced to Hawaii by various acclimatization societies, of which 53 are now established. And so the argument goes, isn't this great? They've sort of compensated for the extinction of these native species, and the total bird biodiversity is about the same. But these ones on the left are globally extinct and will never be seen on the face of the earth again. And the ones on the right, all but one of them, are very common in their native range. Most of them have been introduced elsewhere around the world, and there they are. So the upshot is that one can now, I'm sure some of you have been at the main campus of the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and you can walk around that campus, and even a poor bird watcher, and I'm not a good bird watcher, can easily, in about 3 hours, see birds of 3 and usually 4 continents. But the one thing you won't see there is a native bird. It's sort of like an ornithological United Nations, but there are no native birds. So one could look at this and say, okay, it's good. They're keeping up biodiversity. But I think most people would, it's a value judgment, of course. I think most people would agree with me that this is a tragedy, not a real benefit. And yet you see the same case cited over and over again. It's a brand new book by Thompson, who's one of the signatories of the Nature paper saying the whole issue was overblown. And sure enough, right in it, he said, look, even in Hawaii, invaders tend to make the ecosystem more diverse, not less, as if this is really important. Another argument that one sees in various social science literature and sometimes literature humanities is that there's something inherently xenophobic about concern with and especially management of introduced species. And this argument takes various forms, and I can't spend too much time on it, but probably, I'll give an example that's probably the best known example. This is from the work of Philip Pauly, who's an American historian. He was at Rutgers. He died a few years ago, but quite a prominent historian. And what Pauly pointed to and then developed was the approximate synchrony of the increasingly stringent regulations of human immigration into the United States on the one hand, and increasingly stringent regulation of introduction of plants and animals into the United States on the other. And it's widely recognized that the increasingly stringent regulations on immigration were nativism, pure and simple. They were a response to unease about the huge number of Italians and Eastern European Jews that were immigrating into the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And it culminated in the Omnibus Immigration Act of 1924 that basically stopped immigration except from Northern Europe. And at the same time, approximately, we have these increasingly stringent regulations of movement of animals and plants into the United States. And Pauly just assumes that the motivations for these sequences of regulations are exactly the same. And since we know that xenophobia is at the heart of the human sequence, it must be at the heart of the other sequence. And here he says it outright. Attitude towards foreign pests merged with ethnic prejudices. The gypsy moth and oriental chestnut blight both took on and contributed to characteristics ascribed to their presumed human compatriots, completely ignoring the possibility they actually had impacts on the environment that people were worried about. And these particular cases, they were very well known. They're legendary. If you go back to the congressional record and read the debate at the time that these regulations were passed, regulating the movement of animals and plants, all the discussion is about the horrendous impacts of introduced species, including the gypsy moth was famous, the chestnut blight, which eliminated the dominant tree in a large part of eastern North America. The mongoose was another one adduced often in these congressional discussions. And this is what led to those regulations. So what Pauly has engaged in is what we would call a social construction of a science. It's as if the science is driven by the personalities and psychology of the scientists rather than by any observations of phenomena in the natural world. And I think he's very wrong. I'll spend a little more time on the argument of Davis and others that, well, it might be bad, some of these introductions, but we can't really do much about it because the forces of globalization are arrayed against us with such strength that this is sort of an inexorable process. We're going to have more and more invasion. We better learn to live with them. And it's captured very well by the statement published in Science a few years ago by Mark Gardner, who was at that time the director of the Darwin Research Station in the Galapagos. And here he's talking about an introduced species of blackberry, rubus. And he says, time to embrace the aliens. And you can see he concedes that it's bad, it's decreasing native biodiversity, but then he says, but as far as I'm concerned, it's now a Galapagos native and it's time we accepted it as such. So it's a supremely pessimistic view of the situation. We just give up. And what unites these criticisms of the entire effort as futile and expensive is a failure to consider improved technologies in the way we manage them, and many success stories. These people are acting as if the technology to deal with invasion sort of stopped almost 100 years ago, and we're just doing the same old thing. But in fact, there are many success stories in dealing with invasions, and they're increasingly impressive, and they are in increasingly large areas with more complex problems. So, just as here's a pitch. I'm on the board of an NGO here. It's based in California, in Santa Cruz, called Island Conservation. And the raison d'etre of island conservation is to eradicate invasive vertebrates on islands all over the world where they are threatening native biodiversity. And it's not a very old NGO, and to date it has eradicated over 80 populations of rats, cats, rabbits, dogs, goats, burros, pigs, probably forgetting some things, on over 50 islands worldwide. Began dealing with islands in the Gulf of California and then the Channel Islands, but we now operate everywhere, and they're highly successful, often done on pretty much a shoestring budget. The Japanese have eradicated a fruit fly, the melon fly, from huge islands of the Ryukyu archipelago like Amami Oshima and Okinawa, completely eradicated. And the Australians, one of our famous invaders is the zebra mussel. Well, the Australians detected in 1999 a near relative, the Caribbean black-striped mussel, very similar biology to zebra mussel, in an arm of Darwin Harbor called Cullen Bay. And by the time that they recognized it was there, it had probably been there 6 months to a year. It was spread out over a bay that's around 45 acres in patches that were pretty big. Like in a room this size, there might have been 6 or 7 discrete patches. And rather than giving up and saying, we can't do anything about it, what they did was they cordoned off the bay so no boat could leave it. And within 9 days, they poisoned the bay with thousands of gallons of bleach and many tons of copper sulfate. And they killed every living thing in the bay, including all the Caribbean black-striped mussels. Since then, all of the native species, I believe at one, have recolonized. They all have planktonic larvae and were more or less widespread. The Caribbean black-striped mussel has never been seen again there. So they acted aggressively and quickly, and it worked. It's often said that plant populations can't be eradicated once widely established because they have seed banks in the soil, or they're hard to see, or various things. But there are some cases, like the cochia, a pasture weed that was deliberately but misguidedly introduced into Western Australia. We can't see this. In 1992, within a year, they recognized that it was a bad mistake. And within about 3 years, it had spread over a linear distance of about 800 kilometers and infested thousands of acres. But they started an eradication campaign, and they ultimately got rid of every single plant. It took them until 2000. They didn't declare victory until 2004. It's considered bad form you have to wait 4 years after you see the last one before you say we've succeeded. And that's it. And here's another example, and it points up to an interesting problem. I talked about the killer alga getting into California in Huntington Harbor and also near Carlsbad. And as a matter of fact, in both places, it was probably discovered within about a year of arriving. And at that time, it was spread out over pretty big areas of several acres with patches here and there. And within just a few months, an entity was formed called the Southern California Clerpa Action Team. And they didn't give up. Instead, they tried to cover all the patches with a tarpaulin and then pump bleach or, basically bleach underneath these tarpaulins. And when they missed some, they didn't give up. They just covered them again and continued. And they got every last one. They even held a celebration to commemorate this. wonderful event. And the interesting thing is that the arrival of the killer algae at Carlsbad and Huntington Harbor was a headline story. I'm sure some of you saw it. It was on the front page not only of the LA Times, but of New York Times. And everyone knew about it because it was such a big story earlier in the Mediterranean. But this successful eradication was not in any newspaper except one edition of the LA Times on an interior page, a small article. And this is an issue, and there are many success stories, but they're not publicized. They're not considered as big news as the horror story of the species getting there in the first place. Some of you may have seen another great triumph of eradication, and that is the elimination of the pathogen of cattle and also of wild ungulates that devastated much of Africa for a century, rinderpest. And here was a campaign that began 30 years ago and finally succeeded in 2011. So the species is now extinct. And this involves a very large part of Africa and part of Asia also. But this is just eradication. Many of these critics act as if you can't eradicate it, then you can't do anything, and it's there to stay. But there are actually many other ways to manage eradications and keep them at manage invasions and keep them at low enough densities that, if not being innocuous, at least they're not nearly as damaging. And there are various technologies to do this. I could easily give almost a whole course on each one, but I thought the way I'd give you a sense of what I mean is to take a case that as recently as probably a decade ago people would have said was hopeless, one of the worst invasions in North America, that's now well on its way to being minimized, not eradicated, by a combination of almost all of these techniques. And that's the Australian plant that we call paperbark, Melaleuca quinquenervia. And at its peak in South Florida, it occupied around, and when I say occupied, dominated, around 200,000 acres, so a very substantial part of South Florida. And it's another one of these species ecosystem impacts, because there you see it growing into sawgrass or muley grass meadows. And what it does is it's highly adapted to fires. So highly adapted, as soon as there's a fire, it spreads its seeds, and the fire burns out the native species that are not adapted to these frequent hot fires. And Melaleuca then, even if some of the trees themselves don't burn, because they have this papery bark that burns, but it comes off right away. And even if they all die, there are a gazillion seedlings in the ground coming up that were caused by the fire. And so this looked like a really bad case. But now, after a concerted effort beginning in 1995, it's more than halved. I have data now from 2012. It's down to about 10% of former coverage. And it involved incremental improvement of many different techniques that at first didn't work too well, but then people worked on them and got them to work better. For the first method that could only be used around roads is just adapted machinery to dig them out. And here's a couple examples. They use this both on paperbark and also Australian pine is a major invader. More importantly, because it could cover a much greater area, are herbicides. And Misopir is the main one that they could use aerially. And that got rid of a lot of them, but some of them re-sprout. And so they had to send in teams of volunteers, usually state or national park personnel, however, to attack them right on the ground, cut them down, and then spray that with a different herbicide. Quite early, a biological control program was established, by which I mean they sought in Australia insects that attack paperbark. And then they had to test them to make sure they wouldn't attack native species in North America, and that they had reason to think they would be effective in the field against these. And the first one was introduced, it was a weevil, in 1997. And right up until around for at least 10 years, you could find it again, but it wasn't obvious as having an impact. But now it's very obvious as having a very major impact. It's not attacking the trees, but it's devastating. It's killing most of the seeds on the tree and greatly reducing the number of seedlings that come up. 2 others have been introduced. I would say it's too early to say what impact they're having. Both have survived. They're both attacking Melaleuca, but we don't have data yet to show that they're having big impact, but that they well might. And the weevil is definitely having a big impact. And then there's the use of fire. As I said, it's fire adapted. And so how could you use fire? Well, there is one stage that's not fire adapted, and that is, I said, as soon as there's a fire, it sets a lot of seed, and those grow up into seedlings. And those are not resistant to fire. In nature, after there's a huge fire, there wouldn't be another fire because there's no fuel. So they've evolved not to be fire resistant, but we can start fires. And so when there's a big flush of seedlings, prescribed burns have been a huge help. So all of these together, there's nothing new about any of it, but there's improved technologies for all of it that really have this species on the run. And it's one that would have been viewed as intractable years ago. And then there are what I call bright ideas, totally new ways of dealing with an introduced species that come usually from a different science or a different direction. And you can't say there's going to be a new idea to deal with this species in this year, but you can predict that human ingenuity will generate a certain number of them, and humans do. And every so often a bright idea comes along and changes one whole area. The sea lamprey is the single worst invader in the Great Lakes, North America. It's caused the extinction of 3 major fishes, which constituted a real fishery, and it's attacked many others, and it was controlled for decades moderately well, but at great expense and with many non-target impacts by dams and by chemicals, by lampricides. Very expensive, and it affects many other species that we don't want to affect, native species, in bad ways. Until a fish endocrinologist and behaviorist named Peter Sorensen at the University of Minnesota had a bright idea. He noticed that it was well known, actually, that sea lampreys are anadromous, like salmon. Year after year, they go to the same streams and upstream, and that's where they breed. And then other streams that look identical, they don't go up those. And so you can have a series of streams around one of the Great Lakes, and every 5th or every 7th one will have sea lampreys breeding there, and the others don't. And he deduced from that probably the larval sea lampreys were emitting a pheromone that even in minute amounts could be detected by the adults, and that's how they know which streams to go. So he proved it by taking water larvae had been in and showing it attracted sea lampreys. And then he collaborated with a biochemist to characterize the active ingredient, and then collaborated with other biochemists, and they actually synthesized a synthetic version of it. Now a tiny amount attracts every sea lamprey in a medium-sized lake, and it's widely used now in the Great Lakes and will be increasingly used. And it's really got this species under much better control. Zebra mussels, another example. Zebra mussels are a huge conservation problem because they overgrow native mussels. That's only one of their impacts, but it's threatening the very existence of some rare mussels. But they're also a huge expense to both municipalities and industry because they clog water facilities. And one would think it would be easy to find some chemical that kills them, but they're exquisitely sensitive to any toxic chemical in the water, and so they immediately close their valves and stop filtering water as soon as any chemical is there in minute amounts, and then as the chemical is flushed away, then they open their valves again. So what has been done until recently always is expensive scraping them out, and, manually or with machines, until a group at Cambridge University that had not worked in this area before, who are experts on industrial bead technology. They make micro beads. And they had the bright idea to make a bead that consists of potassium chloride, which is toxic to the mussels, but they coat it with a fatty substance. so that it masks the potassium chloride, gets in the water, zebra mussels filter in huge amounts of it, the fatty substance dissolves, and they die. It can't be used in nature because it does the same thing to native mollusks, but in water facilities, both municipal and industrial, this is not an issue, and it's now widely used. When I was a graduate student many years in the Pleistocene, there was a series of papers in the late 1960s, very early 1970s, suggesting what might be called autocidal methods, where we could use the genetics of a species to cause it to go extinct. And the idea was that somehow it was noticed in nature in both flies and in mice that there were alleles or genes that were not equally distributed among offspring, but that tended to be preferentially incorporated in gametes and then in fertilized eggs. And that these were deleterious. And so the idea was, well, if we could somehow produce these and get it into an invasive population, it would destroy itself. But in the 1960s, there was no technology to do this. There was no way to manipulate genes, and this really was the Pleistocene. But now, we have transgenes where we have various technologies moving genes around and putting them in different places for finding genes, and et cetera, et cetera. And so now there's a whole battery of projects underway to do something like this, to harness the genetics of the species to cause it to go extinct. And it's actually been brought to field trials, at least for a common carp in Australia, and for mosquitoes by a commercial firm in Great Britain operating in North America, though, in the Caribbean. And there's at least another project I know of going on mice. And so what had been viewed sort of as a pipe dream is now well within the range of possibilities for management. In fact, the first field test of the mosquito worked so well that suddenly it was stopped because no one had thought, what could the other consequences be? Could the gene somehow jump to another species? We wouldn't want that. And what would be the consequence of not having any mosquitoes? It sounds great, but we should think through all the possible unintended consequences. There was even a paper published a few years ago suggesting the same approach for introduced invasive plants. To my knowledge, there's no team working on developing it for plants, but this group showed it's certainly feasible, and there are similar genetic underpinnings to the idea in plants. Okay, the last class of objections or controversies about invasions has to do with whenever you have a charismatic vertebrate, especially mammals or birds, and even if they're very problematic and you want to eradicate them or at least kill most of them, very often an animal rights issue and lots of protest. And probably the most famous case globally involves the North American gray squirrel from the east, Sciurus carolinensis, introduced to Italy by accident. It was in a park, and it wasn't contained well, escaped, and started to spread. And in Great Britain, this species has already pretty much eliminated the native red squirrel, and it strips bark from trees also. So they know it's a bad actor. The Italian government very quickly developed an eradication scheme to get rid of it. It was working, and they were stopped cold by an animal rights lawsuit. And it was upheld by the Italian Supreme Court. The project was stopped, and now the gray squirrel has spread into France. It's spreading in France and spreading north, and will eventually get into Austria and probably all of Western Europe, all because of the animal rights lawsuit. If you look closely at these controversies about animal rights, and there are many of them, it basically involves a philosophical issue about the rights of individual sentient animals to exist, and on the one hand, and the rights of species or populations to exist. And this is a controversial philosophical topic with different philosophers advocating the idea of rights of collective entities like species as opposed just to individual rights, and others saying no. So it's not easily going to be resolved, but where you have major animal rights organizations, they inevitably obviously come down on the side of the rights of individual animals, and they have the resources to bring often legal actions. Here in California, I guess many of you know about the controversies about getting rid of rats on Anacapa and pigs on Santa Cruz. There's a wonderful novel. Those who have not read T.C. Boyle's novel, When the Killing's Done, it's a roman à clef about exactly the eradication of rats on Anacapa and pigs on Santa Cruz. And it's almost a primer of invasion biology. You got everything right, and it captures the intensity of the animal rights controversy. So, to sum up, these are the controversies, and I believe that actually the first four will ultimately be resolved by increasing public awareness of what's at stake and the various impacts, and education about the nature of the problem. And then policymakers will follow suit, as they always follow the public rather than lead the public. The last issue, I think, is of a different nature, and it's not a question of increasing education about the stakes that are involved in invasions. It's almost more like a religious issue, and either you believe that individual sentient animals should not be killed, or you think there might be a higher cause. And I think this issue will be with us for a very long time. But I think the others, it's just a question of increasing maturity of the field and increasing understanding of what the impacts are and getting the public to understand this. And I think those will not turn out to impede the progress. So, thank you. I'm sorry to have run over a little bit, but on the other hand, the florid introduction also ran over a bit. So I'm still willing to take questions.
Biological invasions have been with us for a long time, and the ecosystems we have now are the result of evolutionary adaptations to those invasions. It might not another approach be to try to speed up evolution in response to biological invasions?
Well, we actually have data in some cases of quite rapid adaptation to an invasive species. We also have evidence in some cases of rapid adaptation of invasive species in ways that exacerbate their impacts. But in a pretty general way, the various evolutionary processes usually are not nearly sufficiently rapid to make the harmful impacts, to minimize them or even to decrease them. I think Aldo Leopold actually captured this very well in one of his writings, even in Sand County Almanac, well before the advent of invasion biology. He wrote one of the major essays in Sand County Almanac is about introduced species and their horrible impacts. And he said, well, why is it that it's introduced species that do this? And I think he got it right. He said, well, native species have had eons, millennia to co-evolve with one another, and unless humans do something, they're not likely to perturb one another in any way. Whereas introduce an introduced species, introduce a non-native species, it doesn't have those eons of coevolution, and it will probably take a very long time for this to happen. We now know that sometimes it doesn't take too long, but mostly it does seem to take a very long time to happen. And meanwhile, we have species going extinct and populations declining and entire ecosystems changing. So if one takes the very long view, I have little doubt that several tens of thousands of years from now, there will be more accommodation. Will be a number of species have disappeared by then, but I can't be comforted by that. And meanwhile, we do have these various technologies that can deal with the problem now if we adopt them and work on them and try to perfect them.
I appreciate your presentation, and I have actually two questions, or two pieces. I greatly appreciate the information on the Carlsbad area, because I was not aware of that, and the removal of the vegetation. We have a problem in some of our creeks with New Zealand mud snails. And I'm wondering whether or not the pellet you talk about might be effective with those mud snails, and or should we, while the creeks are kind of low ebb during the drought currently, should we try chlorinating or how can we impact them?
The New Zealand mud snail is one of the worst invaders in many areas of western U.S. It's not a filter feeder, so those bio-bullets would not be useful. It rasps vegetation. I wouldn't say we should give up and learn to live with it. It occurs in massive densities, as you undoubtedly know, and it displaces many native species. And there are people working on molluscicides of various kinds, and I am optimistic that there will be some solution. It's just going to take a while. I would not say give up, but the bio-bullets will not be a solution to that case. That would be only for filter feeders, so it may well be useful. There's another mussel called the golden mussel that's a hugely invasive. It's from Asia in South America, and the bio-bullets might well use for that because it's a filter feeder.
Yes, hi. I was just wondering what your opinion is on the genetically modified foods that we have introduced and its effect on biodiversity and the glyphosate that they use.
Yeah. Wow. Huge topic. I have been one of several people who have talked about GMOs in general as being quite analogous to introduced species, partly because there are cases where we can show that a single gene in introduced species or a single small group of them can actually turn introduced species from an innocuous resident into a really invasive species the federal regulatory agencies have generally rejected that argument on the grounds that these GMOs are engineered with great care and precision. And the problem there is that we usually cannot understand the nature of the genetic modification because it's a trade secret in the United States. So questions like, are these stable, and is there any chance that the modifying element could get into some other species by a hybridization event or by being carried by a parasite or what have you, it's hard to assess. And that worries me quite a bit, even aside from the issue of various native species being affected by the habitat change wrought by the massive amounts of GMOs that are on the landscape, like butterflies, not being able to use them or being poisoned by them. So there's that issue. Fortunately, to some extent, glyphosate is self-limiting because it's expensive. And so it's not something you're going to dump from airplanes over large amounts of it over a vast acreage. But, I'll let it go at that. I don't think it should be a widely used tool in the armamentarium. Yeah. Okay. Hi.
Dan, I liked your talk too. I couldn't help thinking during the entire talk about, from a moderately deep time evolutionary perspective, that humans are an invasive species too, and that made me think of this question. Since you vote on these controversies, I wonder how you vote and why about rewilding schemes.
Yeah. I'll answer it first with a little anecdote about humans as an invasive species. The IUCN has this list of 100 of the world's worst invasive species, and I was on the international committee that was convened to come up with this list. And it was about 20 people from all over the world, and it was interesting. At the very first meeting, unanimously, everyone there said, well, obviously the worst invasive species is human beings. And the IUCN categorically refused the possibility of including humans in this list. With respect to rewilding, I think it's potentially ominous because it's basically moving species to places where they aren't. And I also have a certain amount of skepticism about the categorical assertion that native species won't get where they, the related issue of moving species in advance of global warming, et cetera, won't get where they're going to get even without our moving them. But rewilding, I've publicly stated, and I'm not going to repeat it in further publications, that I think that there's a serious danger of unintended consequences from introducing species. It's, of course, it's an inspirational idea, and it's hard not to be moved by the very prospect, but everything we know about invasions and the idiosyncratic and multitudinous impacts that they have that we never anticipated make me very concerned about it.
Thank you for a very informative talk. I'm still trying to understand the logic of different parts of your argument, though. So in the case of the Hawaiian birds, you argued that because even though local biodiversity stayed about the same in numbers, it was a tragedy that the native species went extinct because that reduces global biodiversity. But then when you rolled around to the case of rinderpest, you seem to celebrate the fact that that species is now globally extinct. So in other words, you seem to be doing exactly what you said when you were arguing against Mark Davis we should not be doing. That is, you're making judgments on a case-by-case basis as to whether particular species are desirable or not, beneficial or harmful from a human standpoint.
Well, of course I'm making a judgment. As I said when I talked about the Hawaiian birds, I said specifically, this is my view. I imagine most people would probably agree with me that it's a tragedy, but there are obviously people that don't. And it is a judgment call to me that the extinction of a bunch of native species is a great tragedy, and it's not really recompense for that there's a bunch of thriving introduced species. But that's just how I feel. Davis, or at least some of the signatories of his article, I know, feel quite differently about it. But I can't say one is better than the other. We have a certain amount of legislation in the United States and a certain number of directives in the EU and legislation in other countries that imply that it's public policy that there's something better about native species. But this again is opinion, and I concede the point. All I'm arguing is, we know that there are these impacts, and that should not be an issue of debate. What to do about it, society will have to decide.
Last question, Susan.
Okay. As a layperson who works with the public and concentrates a lot on watershed management, which includes vegetation, I was curious about, is there a balance? And in this Mediterranean biome and ecosystem in the Santa Monica Mountains, we have these legal plant lists, these pallets that Caltrans and all of these people say must go. And at the same time, we have people, we can all agree on arundo, that must go. But when we look at something like a fennel, which grows in Sicily and other Mediterranean ecosystems, but is on a negative plant list here as not native. Is there a balance in as the Kretz and the analysis goes on what are the things we want to keep and what we don't want to keep and what we're going to do about them? Is there a balance where we can take a look at one plant that maybe helps butterflies, doesn't hurt other things, like a fennel? I'm not sure if that's the case with fennel, but I think maybe it might be. And say, okay, it's not native to this particular system, but we don't have to work so hard to get rid of it.
Yeah. I guess, there's two parts of the answer. The first is again, sort of a matter of taste, of what we consider balance in what we want or don't
Have
want.
people that
And-
stop along the side of the road and cut it to taste it.
Yeah, some people like them, other people don't. But there's a major practical issue about the idea that you can maintain a species, and fennel would be a perfect example, in non-problematic amounts because it will reproduce, and it happens to be highly invasive because it spreads. So if you have it in one area, you can be very sure that it's going to be a persistent major management concern. And as you doubtless know, it leads to major fires that then burn out enormous areas. And there's nothing we can do about that. So again, each case would have to be considered on its own merits, but the idea that we can manage in small amounts introduced species generally is very optimistic, very optimistic. And my view is that why should we? We have lots of native species. Why do we want to be the first ones on the block to have some striking exotic?
And we'll leave it at that.